We've all had it. We hear the letterbox go, letter on the floor. We go and open it and say, oh no, I've received a notice of intended prosecution and a request for driver information. Today, we're talking about notices of intended prosecution and requests for driver information and how you should respond to them. But in this video, we're going to try and help explain what to do in those circumstances. In the first instance, and we've got another video on the notice of intended prosecution itself and what that 14-day rule means, so have a look at that one if that's an issue for you. But in terms of receiving this document, I want to talk about what it actually does. This document fundamentally is telling you that your vehicle, usually a vehicle registered to you, or if someone's given your name in connection with an offence, has been detected committing an offence, and the police are asking you for information as to who was driving that vehicle. Now, in the first instance, I think this is quite important. In identifying who the driver was, be that yourself or be it another person, you're not admitting committing the offence. All you're saying is, yes, I was the person driving the vehicle at the time, or no, it was someone else driving the vehicle at the time. But you're not making any admission, and that's quite important to understand, because sometimes people make the mistake of thinking, well, I don't want to fill in this form because I don't accept that I've committed the offence in the first place. And that actually is a fatal mistake, because if you don't fill in the form, if you don't respond to it, then you're going to be prosecuted for an offence of failing to provide driver information. And quite often, that offence of failing to provide driver information is more serious than the offence to which the notice relates in the first place. So I'll give you an example. You receive a notice of intended prosecution and request for driver information for doing 36 in a 30. Now, quite often, if you identify yourself, if that's the case, you might be offered a speed awareness course if you've not done one previously. It's certainly within the speed threshold for that to happen. Or you might be offered a 3-point fixed penalty notice, £100, 3 penalty points. But if you don't respond to the notice, what will happen instead is you will be prosecuted for the offence of failing to provide driver information, which actually carries 6 penalty points and a fine of up to £1,000. So you take what was relatively minor and you turn it into something that's a lot more serious, and the penalty is more significant. What do you do when you receive it then? Well, this is quite straightforward. If you were the driver, even if you don't accept you've committed the offence, you fill in the form, you give your licence details, you sign it, you put it in an envelope and you send it back. In some cases there can be portals to fill in the information online, but most of the time we do this in paper form. Now, what I would always recommend in those cases is if you do post it, you get a certificate of postage from the post office just to demonstrate that you posted it, in case at any stage in the future the police try and say you haven't responded. It will forearm you to prove that you did what you were meant to do, and that would be a defence to say, hang on a minute, I actually responded to your notice. Now, moving on from that, there are always, of course, cases where you get this notice and you think, oh, I don't think it was me. I think I was somewhere else on that day. Or I lent my car to my friend Dave, or my wife was driving, or my son, my daughter, whoever it may be. And the answer to that is, if you know who the other person driving was, you simply name them. You fill out the form, you name the person, and in due course, that other person will then be sent their own notice of intended prosecution and request for driver information. What happens if you don't know who the driver was? Well, the answer to that is, of course, you shouldn't name someone unless you know it was them. Now, I wouldn't apply that too rigidly. We're not talking about being 100% certain that it was you, because if you look at it and say, well, in all probabilities it was me, but there's a vague possibility it wasn't me, then I would tend to say the better thing to do is simply to accept that it most likely was you. But in cases where you're pretty certain it wasn't you, name the other person. And in those cases where you're just unsure, what the law says is that you have to take all reasonably practicable steps to work out who the driver was. And what that might entail is going and speaking to all those people who have access to the car, all those people who might drive the car. In some cases, it will include potentially looking at a bank statement to see if anyone's put petrol in the car on that particular day. But the real test is that you do everything in your power to try and work out who the person was. Because if you don't identify the person and you're then prosecuted before the court for failing to provide driver information, You can, if you've done your best, potentially defend the charge on the basis that you have done, that first of all, it wasn't you who was driving, but that you have taken all of those reasonably practicable steps, you've exercised reasonable diligence to work out who the driver of the car is. And if you've done all those things, then it will stand you in good stead to defend the charge. Another thing I'd say to do, if you have doubt of who it was, write to the police, explain your problem. If you know who the potential drivers are, give them the names of the potential drivers. Explain that these people have access, that they have insurance to drive the car. Explain the steps that you're taking to try and work out who it is. And also potentially ask the police for photographic evidence. Say to them, have you got any photographic evidence that might show the face of the driver? It could even be that that photograph shows you the sex of the driver, male or female, and that helps you narrow down who it may possibly be. Now, just briefly on that point, it's quite often asked, do the police have to give me photographic evidence? The answer to that is no. There's no mandated provision where the police have to give you that photographic evidence, but it's certainly good to ask for it because it's part and parcel of that reasonable diligence, of those reasonable measures you're taking to try and work out who the driver is. And if you are ultimately in that position before a court, you will be able to use as part of your defence the fact that you asked for the police for the photographic evidence because it might have helped you know who the driver is. In summary, what I would say to do when you receive that notice, first of all, if you were the driver, in general terms, identify yourself as the driver. If you weren't the driver and you know who it was, name that person as the driver. And if you don't know, make all reasonable steps, take all reasonable steps to try and work out who it was. If you still can't do it, write to the police, tell them who all of the possible drivers were, because that goes to the point of credibility if it ever goes to court, and also explain what steps you've taken and ask for that photographic evidence. Ultimately, if it does end up at court, you can have that defence that you've taken all those reasonable steps, you'd exercise reasonable diligence to try and work out who the driver was. These things can be complicated, they're not nice to receive through the post. If you do have questions on anything arising from this, if there's answers that you still may need, then certainly contact Caddick Davis solicitors, or indeed contact any solicitor and have that conversation as to what you might be able to do. Hopefully today's episode has been helpful and it's answered some of the questions that you may have had about this subject. If it has been helpful, please share it to your network, and if you haven't done so already, please like, subscribe and press for your notifications so you hear about future episodes.